Thank you. This was the most beautiful introduction ever. I was actually crying behind the poster. As a professional speaker, I have to set my own timer because I'm professional. Just an announcement before I start my actual talk. I'm very, very humbled to invite you to the official, secret, unofficial after party. It's going to happen at a place called Kanal. I didn't have Wi-Fi, so I couldn't translate it to funny Cyrillic characters. So yeah, I'm pretty sure you know the place because it must be an awesome place, and it's also a great idea in general to have the after party after day one, and then have another day of conference. Is always great. So I always love to talk at the last slot because I'm a little bit hungover, but that's fine. So my official conference talk title was From OOP to Functional Programming and Beyond. And you can see I'm really talented with GIMP because I'm using Linux and I don't have Photoshop. It was a beautiful backdrop for this conference, but I decided to make it even fancier and just call this talk Trailblazer because apparently that's what I'm talking about. Actually, I'm not only talking about Trailblazer and functional programming and object-oriented programming, I'm talking about simplicity in this talk, yeah? Because it's the last talk of the day and everyone is really tired. Are you tired? No. Are you ready for the after party? Yeah. Woo! That's how I like it. Alrighty, so this is a bunch of my friends and me 2 years ago. Actually, I can't find myself on the photo, but I'm there. And so this is about the age when I started to learn about programming. I mean, I didn't actually know what the fuck I was doing, but I started to get interested in, hey, how do I operate? How do I command a computer instead of just playing with it? Because I was one of the first kids in my town to have an Apple computer, Classic 2. And you know, the little box that people now use for fish bowls. And so I had 5 games because at that time we only, Apple wasn't cool. I had Apple before it was cool. And so I started to play a bunch of computer games all in black and white. And for some reason I wanted to start programming a computer game. And my dad bought me this book, and back in the days, a book like this costs 200 Deutschmark. And it was imported from America and everything, and I didn't even really speak proper English. But this was kind of my first programming book I read, Tricks of the Mac Game Programming Gurus. It's pretty awesome. I still have it somewhere. And then I started to, I realized, oh shit, game programming actually means you have to learn how to program. So, and the book was written in C++, which is the perfect language for a 9-year-old kid to learn programming in a different language. So so I started to learn C++, and variables and if and else and all this kind of stuff. And I remember exactly the day when I learned about functions. Yeah, so I understood, okay, a function is a component that I can reuse. Oh, you're so cold. But you're so close to me. Okay, I'll stop this. So the function is a component, I got that, but I didn't understand. Stop it, you make me nervous. I didn't understand why the argument A and B, why you can name the arguments the way you want. I thought you had to name them whatever the user of the function, the name uses, you have to have that name. So I didn't really understand what's the point. And then I kept thinking about it, and I was driving with my dad in a car. I remember that day. It was beautiful. The sun was shining on a cloudy November day in March. And so my dad kept explaining what is a function to me. And at some point it made click. So I understood, okay, this is a component, a piece of logic that is not affected by anything that is happening on the outside. So I push something in, do some stuff, return something, and nothing else changes. And that really intrigued me. I mean, I had no idea I will be standing on stages and talking about components and object orientation and functional programming. But that was the moment when I realized, cool, programming is a lot about structuring, yeah, and a function is kind of my best friend. And then I made a big mistake and started to learn Perl. So that was my first kind of. This is how I learned. This is how I started to get into web programming. My friend, actually, I have to hurry up because I'm talking and talking and talking. So my friend asked me, "Hey, are you good with databases?" I'm like, "What?" And so I started to learn about web programming, and back then you had to use like PHP or Perl, and in the end of like after 1 or 2 years, I actually had a website up and running to sell boats and yachts. It's not that I own a lot of boats and yachts, but like people would put their advertisements. It was like eBay for rich people, basically. I wrote eBay for rich people, and no one used it. But this is kind of the story. And while I was doing Perl, I was still, intrigued by the idea of like components and having code that is not affected by other code and like minimizing side effects. I didn't even know what side effects, what the word means. But so I had a really strict object-oriented way of designing my Perl code. And then I did another mistake and started to learn Ruby on Rails. And so I really Ruby is an amazing language, especially when you come from Perl, because Perl is so ugly, and then Ruby looks really beautiful, and it has a dot operator and not a weird-looking arrow, and you have actually objects instead of having to bless some reference and this kind of stuff. But in Rails, so my first problem with Rails was that I didn't really like that you only have 3 buckets for code, like model, view, controller, and you just throw lots of like validations and callbacks and scopes and everything into models, and you do the same basically in the controllers. You have again like validations and authorization code and business code, everything in the controller, and it's kind of hard to see. If I ask someone where is the code sitting for updating a blog post or something like that, they will say, here a little bit in the controller, and here in my own service object, and here in the model. And so I was missing the structure, like the structure from a domain view, like put stuff to update a comment or a blog post into some bucket for that task, yeah? And because I didn't find that really, Rails is cool and easy and simple to learn, but once it gets a bit more complex, it's actually not that simple anymore because it doesn't give you the abstractions that I was wanting, but I didn't know what I want. It's the same problem in life. So I started to work on a few like gems. Actually, the sales gem was my first gem, and back then we didn't even have gems. It was called, I think it was just a Rails extension or something, Rails plugin. And so what Sales does is, this is Amazon. I did not write Amazon. I only wrote eBay for rich people. Don't confuse that. So what Sales does is it basically helps you to do like, sidebars or like reusable widgets in Rails. Yeah. So just encapsulate that code and the view for a reusable widget. And it just like you had a class and some code for that widget, and then you could call that class or that object with a helper method, and it would render only that particular component. And the cool thing was, you could also test that in isolation. Yeah, so I could test my partial or my widget in a unit test and not in some big ass integration test. And that was pretty cool because I love when I can test stuff in isolation. That's really cool. And that's again, the thinking about like coming from this fascination about functions. This was kind of intuitively made sense to me. And not only to me, even DHH liked it. Have you heard of DHH? So just to remind you, so here's the email. It's from 2008, and he just said like, "Hey, I really like sales," and this was like really, like I felt really cool. This is why I have this slide here, and of course nothing evolved from that, and they didn't want sales in Rails, and I didn't want sales in Rails, and then we're still friends. By the way, DHH is the guy who recently does a lot of talking about software architecture, and he likes stuff like, hey, put a million of methods and modules in one class called the model, and it's amazing because we do it in Basecamp, and everything we do in Basecamp is great. Okay. Another gem I worked on, just really quick, is the reform gem. Yeah, it's a gem that only sorts out validations with form objects. Yeah, so if you have a form on your website, like a typical thing with like fields and whatever and field sets, so you have a class that matches that UI form, and in that class you define the fields and you define the validations, and that's only for this form. Yeah, instead of pushing validations into the model or into controller code, you have all the validations in that class. Yeah, don't worry about the actual API. And the cool thing is, again, you can test it. So you can test that validation in isolation without having to consider the entire complexity of your application. You can test your beautiful validations. It will give you a result object, done. Yeah, function, call the function, give me something back, done. And I really like that. This guy has some strange hobby. I think he's swimming in mud or something. So the problem was that we had those gems, but it's still, when I worked in Rails code bases, I still felt kind of lost a lot of times because I was still missing some kind of like structure. And at the same time, there's like the Rails inventor DHH, you know, telling people, hey, push all the code into one class, it's amazing, and I made $1 million with it, and if I make $1 million, you can make $1 million with it. And I mean, look at this. This is like, he's including like 30 modules into a class that is already overloaded with code, and that's not good software design. That's just, you know, I mean, yeah. So it was really hard for me to work on, to think about alternatives when you have someone else shouting to people to make the opposite. It's like politics. And you know, the more you separate components in your code, the simpler it gets. And I don't find it simple to have like one class with 1 million responsibilities. And this is when I started to think about some alternative framework. And what I did was I started working on Trailblazer. But the key in Trailblazer is that it does not replace Rails, okay? So we are not trying to make all the cool things of Rails null and void. We're extending the framework. And if anyone has a good inspirational quote, please tell me. Something like, change your thinking and you will change the way you think, or something like that. So the idea of Trailblazer was, in the first version, was that you have very simple controllers. Yeah, the controller only does HTTP-specific stuff and rendering. And you call what we call an operation. You invoke an operation, and the operation takes over the entire like orchestration of the business code. So controllers are very simple. Models only do what Active Record is good at, querying and writing to the database. We can discuss, I mean, this is a different discussion if the writing part in Active Record is good or not, but Active Record is great for database-specific, like for SQL abstraction. It is not great for callbacks, it's not great for validations, and it's not great for domain code. Yeah? So in Trailblazer, the goal is to have an Active Record class that only does SQL abstraction, okay? Because that is the idea of Active Record, if you look it up. So the controller and the models are kind of cleaned up. Instead, we introduce a new structure called operations. And in the operations, every operation has only one responsibility: creating a comment, deleting a user, archiving a blog post. Yeah, and that is not done. So lots of people were like, "Oh, okay, so you're creating just another God object. Like the operation is now doing all the code, and you just move the code." That is true. But the operation is not implementing everything in one big chunk of code. The operation is orchestrating to different stakeholder objects, like form objects, or like Active Record, or SQL, or ROM, or whatever you want. Or, you know, we have policy objects and this kind of stuff. So the operation is an orchestrator container and not implementing everything. It's very beautiful. And here's an example of the version 1. I hate it so much. I don't know why I actually put this slide here. Maybe I should just remove the code so you stop looking at it. So as you can see, an operation is, again, a class. So we introduced a new class. And when we did that, I mean, you see the name, comment create. So what is it going to do? Right, it's going to create a comment. And lots of people were really scared and paranoid. Oh, God, what? You're creating new classes in Ruby. You shouldn't be, like, you're not putting it into the model, you're not putting it into the controller. You have a new class. Oh my God, this is going to be so slow, and it feels wrong. Like, why would you have a class? It's like, hey, this is object orientation from the book. Like, if you have something to solve, you solve it in a separate class. And Ruby's garbage collection is designed for small objects that die really quickly and not for huge monolithic objects. I mean, they changed it recently to support Rails. But the funny thing was that the Trailblazer way was actually speeding up applications. And just to give you a quick, actually, I don't want to talk about a lot of code, but there's lots of code in my talk, so I have to talk about code. So the idea of this operation was that you have a class, and you invoke that class using the call method. And don't worry about all the different, about how that works internally and everything. The idea is there's only one public method. So you call that operation, it runs whatever it does, and returns you a result object. And there's no other public method. That's the idea. So it's basically like a function in functional programming, because you have no way to screw up system state. And what you get back in one point in the version 1 is a result object, and in the result object it will tell you like I was successful or I was not successful, so it was some kind of binary state. And you could ask you could ask the operation instance, because you still had an instance, and you could ask the operation instance for like application state you needed. And that was a mistake, of course. The cool thing was, you already guessed it, you can test it. So you can call that operation in a unit test, and it does exactly the same in a test that it does in a controller. That's amazing. And it's really hard in Rails to have that behavior without an integration test. So the idea was take the code into a separate class and make it testable. I love testing. Have I mentioned that I really like testing? It's great. The other amazing thing with the operation was that you could also use an operation as a factory. So instead of having to use, factory bot or whatever you use for your fixtures, I liked the discussion earlier yesterday, you would just use operations, a chain of operations to set up application state. Yeah, I want to create a user, another user, a group, put those both users in a group, so you call all the operations, and I have the exact same application state that I will have in production. Yeah, so you will never have a leaky, half-assed test state, which happens a lot with factory bot. This is gone by using operations. So just by making something explicit, it made it actually simpler. And then I had a really great idea, and I'm absolutely not I'm not recommending to do the same, is I started writing a book about a framework that I was writing at the same time. It's fucking horrible. Because you have to change you change the API, you change the book. You change the book, you have to change the API. It's a nightmare. And the other thing was, so the book was called Trailblazer, a new architecture for Rails. It's for free. You don't have to buy it. If you buy it, I will have more money to buy Rakia tonight, which is great. So go and buy it. So the thing was, the book was called A New Architecture for Rails. People got really mad at me because they were like, okay, there's a book, so that project must be finished, must be ready to use, must be awesome, and it's solving all our problems. And it did not solve all the problems. Surprise, open source. And they got really mad at me. So I kept telling them, hey, the book is called A New Architecture for Rails, and not a new architecture for Rails that is going to solve all your problems and write code automatically and blah, 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 blah. So it was like really crazy. When you write a book, people really think something is perfect. It's crazy. And yeah, it was absolutely not perfect. And writing while you work on a framework is not a good idea. But it always felt like, when you are a computer engineer, people think you can fix your computer. And when you write a book, people think everything is amazing and perfect. And everything has to, it solves everything, everything, yeah? Just write books and people think everything is perfect. Yeah, so in the first iteration of Trailblazer, that was 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years, the main idea was have that operation that reflects a verb of your domain, creating, deleting, whatever, archiving, and have that in a beautifully encapsulated class that does only one thing. I love simplicity. And a big mistake was that the operation had one method called process, and in that process method, you would do all the code you need to do. Yeah, like creating something, validate. There was lots of API on top of that. The details don't matter, but you were responsible to orchestrate what the operation does in the process method, and that was fucking stupid. So what happened was that people wanted to do, so the operation, when you call the operation, it did a couple of things automatically, like, calling a policy or parsing whatever input you give in, and then it would run the process method, and then you were supposed to run your code. And people, of course, want to change that. They want to run the policy before another policy. They want to have validations run after a policy or whatever. And people had to know the call stack of the operation, so they had to know the internals. And that was really, really stupid because, first of all, the internals were shit because I wrote them. And second, no one wants to learn and read about a call stack and okay, what method is called in what order, and it was just really stupid. But the problem was I came from C++, Perl. All you know is objects and call stacks. I mean, you call a method, that calls a method, that calls a method, that calls a method. So I was innocent, but it was the wrong design. It turned out to be the absolutely wrong design for an orchestration class. Yeah. Ah, you're back. I missed you. You mean you missed you or you missed me? So the problem I was just showing with the call stack is that you have to know the internals, and if you want to change the internals, you have to include modules. Yeah, and that's the Ruby way. That's like what is it called? There's a word for it. I forgot it. And the word was shit. You include a module to change the internals that you have to know, and then you include another module, and and then you start to call the original behavior with super, and you add another module that calls the other, and you override stuff, and you always have to call super in a specific method. I had much more code in that talk, but I removed it because I want to go to the pub, and so the problem is that Ruby is not designed for orchestration. It's designed to be a script language. And it has objects, and these objects are great, but the way modules work, or are supposed to work, is a nightmare. And then they came up with refinements, and I'm sorry, but no one uses refinements except for Vlad. And so the idea of having methods calling methods with super and everything and modules it's super complicated, and I don't like it. I thought it's the way you have to do it, but I found out this is actually not really a good architecture. Yeah? I mean, I don't know if you have looked at the Rails core code, for example. They do that all the time, and you never know which method is called in what order because it's just crazy. So maybe the problem is like in the language. Yeah. So that was my finding, was that maybe I'm using Ruby the wrong way. Yeah, because I want to do something else. I want to have an orchestration. I want to rearrange the way things are called without having to know all the internals. And then I looked out of the window and, beautiful horizon. It's a disk, by the way, so the Earth is flat. You know that, right? And so I got more and more, I got into functional programming. I didn't even know that I'm getting into functional programming. So functional programming, of course, it's like super complicated. You have to be like a mathematics professor with like a long white beard and write weird shit on a wall. So actually, the idea of functional programming is super simple. You have a function that you call with input, and it gives you something back, the output. Yeah, so you get something in, it gets some processing, and return something, and nothing else changes. That's the amazing thing about functional programming, is that you don't change the outer. Like, I pass something in, but nothing happens. The only thing that happens is I get some output back. So that's pretty intriguing. And so I looked at the operation. Actually, what we do is exactly the same. Like, you invoke that operation with the call method. You call a function. You have some input, and it gives you some output. Yeah. So that's basically an operation is a function. I didn't see it as a function until I learned about functional programming and how amazing it is. Yeah. The problem was, I realized, okay, cool, we actually have a function already. Like, it's an object-oriented function, but it's a function. The problem was, we still have this Gesundheit. We still have this terrible call stack you need to know and all the internals, and I didn't like this. So in the next version of Trailblazer 2.0, we, instead of letting the user, implement everything in the process method, and it was super messy, we introduced a DSL where you can say, this is the steps I want to do for my business code. I saw that you were yawning. This is exactly how I feel. So if you look at this operation, pass, step, step, fail, basically what it builds is in the background is a graph like this, yeah? So you see there's a lot of steps, and sometimes if something goes wrong, you go to some separate track, we call it. So this is called the upper track, the right track, and this is called the left track. And to create this kind of work, so you don't have to program this workflow yourself, you use the DSL that you just saw here. Actually, it's something we stole. It's from railway-oriented programming from the functional community. I think it was in F# or something. So it's a very well-known pattern for orchestrating logic without you having to do the control flow. So the way it works is, in normal case, it would just execute all the steps on the right track, and if something goes wrong, for example, in validate or in save, it jumps to the left track and skips the rest of the steps on the right track. This took me about 14 minutes to generate this animation in GIMP with 17 layers, and I was using LibreOffice. It was like hardcore. I mean, can I get some applause for this animation? It's an animated GIF. Thank you. I know. I should be graphics designer or something. Okay, so the idea is very simple, and it's called Railway, that pattern. And we love that in Trailblazer, so we kind of gave people the ability to create such a railway with a very simple DSL, and the visualized model would be a very simple graph. And every step would be either an instance method or a callable Ruby object. So the details, again, they do not matter, but they always, all they can do is write to some context object they get, and that's the only way to mutate state. And in that step, you can do whatever you want. You can do active record, you can run your reform validation, you can use, I don't know, Stripe API, whatever. And the other cool thing is that, so we had those steps, and we are also allowed to nest those things, yeah, to nest functions, but again in a declarative way. So you could nest, I don't know, comment save to Redis, for example, is a separate operation, and you could nest that in an existing operation. Yeah, so the way the graph looks is like this. It's super confusing, but yeah, here's the nested operation, and then the nesting operation will call that, and blah, 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 and it goes, and cool things happen. But I think, like, visually with diagrams, it's way easier to explain what is happening than with if and else in your Ruby code and calling super and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so the idea was, again, functional. You call functions which are steps or which are, again, operations, and those receive some input and generate some output without mutating any state. So no more call stacks. You didn't have to understand the call stack of the operation anymore. If you want to know what the operation does, you look at this DSL, or you let it render a graph, a feature which I'm going to discuss in a second. And you would instantly understand the workflow or the control flow of the operation, which is amazing. People used it, and they were really excited. And of course, after one day, they started to complain about missing features because, yeah, it's still like I'm still not Jesus. I can't read what people I can't read minds yet. So there was lots of stuff missing, and oh god, this is really cool. The idea, I'm going to copy it, but you also need to implement feature A, B, 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 C, and F. So for example, what they wanted was tracing. They wanted to see, if I run an operation, what's the path it took? Yeah, did it go this way? Did it go that way? Did it go this way or that way? So they wanted tracing. Yeah, tracing is actually really cool. You're laughing, but it's awesome. So that was one feature they wanted, and they wanted lots of more features. And they never say like, "Hey, this is actually really cool." It's always like, "This is really cool, but." So open source sucks. Yeah. So they wanted features, and I figured out, okay, actually with the current implementation, something like tracing, tracing is an optional feature. You don't want that in production, for example. You don't want to trace all the inputs and outputs in production. So I had to change basically the entire implementation of the operation again for the version 2.0, I think, no, 2.1, which is finished since Thursday on the plane. So yeah, the version 1 and version 2 was a big break, because instead of the process method, you had this DSL, and this is me discussing with one of the users, why the hell did you break the API? So people don't like it when you innovate. People like to work with the old shit all the time, because if you change something, it means work for them, even if it's better for them, and that is not good. So please don't change your APIs ever, and be like Rails and do the same for 20 years. So yeah, it's like working on open source is amazing. It's like an experiment about psychology. It's amazing. You learn so much. So if you innovate, people will kick your ass, and then 2 weeks later they will say, "Hey, actually, that was a cool thing what you did. Thank you." But yeah, so there was some friction with the change from like object-oriented to functional, but people kind of started to appreciate it. Dolphins, the only mammals that can breathe underwater, or something like that. Yeah, so that was a bumpy ride from the first days of Trailblazer to what we have now. Yeah, it was crazy. So in the new version, we gave them tracing, because I also became an actual team of people, which is awesome when you have people helping. I could give presentations about open source and what fun you have with people, but I can't because we want to go to the pub. So we gave them tracing, so they could finally see what happened and what inputs and what outputs were used and what was the state of the context object in every step. And it's actually a really cool feature, but we had to change the entire API. And we also gave them the ability to have like crazier connections. Like some people wanted to, to like jump. They didn't want the railway. They wanted to do crazy stuff like going back and, having like suspension and whatever. Like, so here you go. It all works now. And that is the point when I started to work for the German police. I go to work like this, by the way. And it's really funny. Like, I'm absolutely not the person to to want to work for the police or something. But what I do is really cool. So they use Trailblazer, which is funny enough. And then they asked me, "Hey, you want to come and just give us a workshop for 3 days about Trailblazer?" And yeah, I said yes, okay. And 3 days became 1.5 years of hardcore consulting. It's amazing because they paid Trailblazer 2.1 basically. I mean, I didn't tell them that I'm working on Trailblazer 2.1. I was sitting in the office and looking like I work, but whatever. So the police had one massive problem. By the way, I'm a bass player, not a guitar player, which is why I'm in love with Sting. He's a great bass player. So the police had one big problem. I mean, the police has many problems, but the problem I was supposed to solve was they had shit tons of documents with diagrams and text, and the text and diagrams were supposed to describe workflows in the police, like a background check on criminals, or I don't know, how to when someone updates their driver license, what is the internal workflows, what systems are triggered, and so on. So they have a million folders full of diagrams, and the diagrams have absolutely zero correlation to the code. Yeah, the code, Ruby, which is also really funny. The police uses Ruby, so the code and the diagrams are completely out of sync. And my job, my idea was, because I already had this diagram stuff in Railway and Trailblazer in mind. So the idea was, why not use the mechanics we have in Trailblazer to model the code? So we can save a lot of control flow code, and we can generate diagrams from the code automatically that describe those documents. So you don't need those documents, basically. And that was pretty cool because everyone likes diagrams at the police. And then they said, yes, do it. We give you 5 months. And after 1 month, they said, oh, by the way, we give you 7 months, actually 8. And then, this is how you get caught, basically. So the police was using a standard called BPMN. That's Business Process Modeling Notation. It's from the Java community. It's actually a really cool thing. I should start to wear suits and a tie when I give presentations about BPMN because it will make me look like a professional consultant, which you should hire. So BPMN is awesome. It's just basically a diagram language where you have boxes and stuff. So BPMN is amazing. Like business guys like BPMN. Chuck Norris is a big fan of BPMN. Donald Trump also is a huge supporter of BPMN. He's a businessman. And of course, DHH likes BPMN. Not. So BPMN is really just boxes, circles, arrows, squares, and vomiting unicorns. I'm kidding, of course, on the latter one. There's no squares in BPMN. There's only rectangles. So BPMN has 500, 600 pages documentation. You don't need to read them. This is all you need to know. And you have like this is called a collaboration. So you can have different actors, and then those actors can communicate via those via those arrows, and it's super simple. And you look at diagrams, and you actually understand what is going on. Yeah, you can nest those activities, as they call them. You have like end events, and this is something you learn it once in like 5 minutes, and then you understand it. Yeah, and you have events, so you can trigger events, and you can catch events, which is really cool for decoupling components. And that is really only you need to know, and the only thing. And we had all those mechanics in Trailblazer already, because we had the activity, like we actually called the operation is now an activity, and we already had all the wiring mechanics, to connect boxes with arrows. That's all you need to implement a BPMN tool. What we did on top of that, and that is what I did for the police, is that we came up with a new gem on top of Trailblazer. That is for modeling workflows, and that's the actual interesting new thing in 2.1 is that we now allow defining long-running workflows with millions of requests, and the workflow engine will always know what happens and what is allowed to run. So here we have a visual editor now where you can draw those workflows. This is a really stupid example, I'm sorry. And the visual editor can also render from existing code, so it's pretty cool. It's like fashionable in like grayscale. It looks cool. It's not made with GIMP, by the way. But the amazing thing is you can now do stuff like you can provide library workflows. Yeah, for example, here you see the Tyrant gem. That's an authentication gem, and that provides workflows for your application. But you don't have to override anything or use Ruby to change the way Tyrant this is, for example, a sign up with a one-time password, what it does. So you can use that library workflow in your application. This is the application workflow, and don't worry about the details. The cool thing is now you can use a collaboration. It is called in BPMN. So whenever the library workflow triggers or receives events, this will trigger something in your application workflow. So in other words, you don't have to write all the control code. You just write your steps, the boxes you see. And what was that? And so the Trailblazer will take over the flow control. So you basically only focus on implementation and not about control flow. That's the idea of the workflow gem. It's amazing. I really love it. And you can use events, and you can see I used the GIMP explosion tool. Okay, the job is getting a bit old. So here's just an example for what an activity would look like, and here's an example of what such a collaboration diagram. Like you actually can code that. You don't have to draw that. You can code it. This is just an example. So the idea is you move from a very, we came from the super Ruby-oriented like coding with like overriding modules and calling super into some really visual programming style where you have small components, functions that get called, and when they get called is up to Trailblazer's job or the job of the guy or girl who models those workflows. And it's just the last code example, just really simple. So the way you use those workflows is not like fancy, crazy things running in the back of a Java engine. What you do is this is a controller action. So you call the workflow from controller actions. And you generate events, and you pass the events into that workflow engine, and the engine will take care of what to call when. And so basically it takes away your control flow code. It's not crazy. And you have beautiful tracing, which looks amazing, especially when you draw it on a diagram with GIMP. So you can trace those processes, and that's amazing for the police because they have long-running processes. They run like a couple of months. They trigger thousands of APIs getting data about criminals or not criminals. And you have to orchestrate that and time that, and if some request takes longer than 3 days, do this and that, and you can do all that kind of stuff with the workflow tool, and you can visualize it and trace it, and that's really amazing. But it's my programming side has changed from really like it's so simple now with all the visual stuff. Yeah. So to sum this up, I started with Ruby. And I started to, write gems, and I went the Ruby way, overriding with modules and having like big objects that do a lot of stuff. And then I realized, okay, there's actually better approaches. And the cool thing about Ruby is, I mean, the language, I'm not super happy with the way the language evolves, because it doesn't evolve. It only gets faster. But I'm super happy with the community, because there are so many cool gems recently in the last couple of years. You know, like Hanami, Trailblazer, DryRB, Eventide, this is an event sourcing gem. There's so much technology where people create new abstractions that help us to actually deal with whatever problem you're trying to solve. So once you leave this room and you go to the pub and you get drunk and then on Monday you have to work, take a few minutes and read about new projects that have popped up recently in Ruby. Because in the last 2 or 3 years there was an amazing curve of innovation happening. And I think Ruby really, really needs those new abstractions that people are creating. Yeah? And all those new abstractions, and that's great, all those gems, embrace the idea of functional programming. It's super simple, there's no side effects, and everyone is creating more and more components, and that is really, really, really well appreciated in my world. Yeah? So embrace the idea of simplicity and create components and abstractions instead of pushing everything into one class and 2 weeks later you have no idea what's happening. Yeah? And thank you for listening, but don't forget to come and party with me at the Canal. Thank you.